15 years ago, a magnitude 7.3 earthquake struck the Japan Trench. It was logged. It was analysed. It was forgotten by the next morning. 51 hours later, nearly 20,000 people were dead, and 3 nuclear reactors were melting into the ground beneath Fukushima. The 7.3 had been a foreshock. Nobody knew. Nobody could have known. Today, at 4:52 p.m. local time, a magnitude 7.5 earthquake just struck the same fault system, directly up dip of that exact rupture patch. Which leads to one terrifying question every seismologist in Tokyo is asking. What if this one is the foreshock? Stay with me, because by the end of this, you will know why the next 48 hours will be absolutely crucial. If this has you hooked, hit like and subscribe to the Skylab because you're going to want to be here when the next wave of data comes in. Drop a comment below. I genuinely want to know where in the world you're watching this from, what time it is there, and your honest answer to this. If the Japan Trench is already following the 2011 foreshock playbook step by step, producing a magnitude 7.5 earthquake in the same fault system, could this just be a coincidence or the beginning of something nobody wants to say out loud? Let me know what you think. Now, let us get into it. Part 1. The moment that changed the framing. At exactly 4:52 p.m. Japan Standard Time on April 20th, 2026, the seafloor roughly 100 kilometers east-northeast of Miyako, on the Pacific side of Honshu, did something violent. A section of the subduction interface, the place where the Pacific plate grinds beneath the North American plate, slipped, and when it slipped, it released an enormous burst of energy that radiated outward in every direction, rolling through the bedrock of Tōhoku, reaching Tokyo in minutes, and sending a pressure wave up through the water column that sensors across the Pacific immediately began to track. The magnitude came in between 7.4 and 7.5. In earthquake terms, that is what we call a major event, not a megaquake, not a once-in-a-century rupture, but a major tsunami-capable earthquake along one of the most dangerous fault systems on planet Earth. The depth is where things get interesting, about 11 kilometers below the seafloor. That is shallow enough that the energy had very little Earth to absorb it before reaching the water, shallow enough to displace the ocean above it almost directly, and shallow enough that, within seconds of the shaking beginning, the Japan Meteorological Agency's tsunami prediction system had already classified this as a tsunami-generating event and triggered warnings. Within minutes, those warnings were broadcast across Iwate, Miyagi, and Aomori prefectures. Expected wave heights of 1 to 3 meters, which translates to about 3 to 10 feet. That placed the alert at the second highest tier Japan uses, not the maximum, which is reserved for waves expected to exceed 3 meters, but close. Close enough that evacuation orders were not suggestions. They were immediate, mandatory, and enforced. The first waves, when they arrived, were small, about 40 centimeters, a little over a foot of water rising against the harbour walls, and if you were watching the live footage, you might have thought, well, that is not so bad. That is almost nothing. Why are they still telling people to run? And here is where Japan's hard-earned wisdom kicks in. Because tsunamis do not arrive as a single wave. They arrive as a train of waves, and the first one is very rarely the largest. The second or third or fourth wave can be double or triple the height of the first. The ocean takes time to respond to a displacement on the seafloor. The energy sloshes, reflects off undersea topography, piles up in narrow bays, and can arrive minutes or even hours after the shaking stops. Japan learned this lesson in blood in 2011, and tonight, nobody on that coast is making the mistake of assuming the danger has passed just because the first wave was small. Now, while evacuations were still in progress, another protocol kicked in. Nuclear inspections. 5 facilities, including the name that still sends a chill through anyone who remembers the footage from March of 2011. Fukushima Daiichi. Inspectors moved through each site checking cooling systems, containment structures, spent fuel pool levels, emergency generators, and the status of ongoing decommissioning work at the Daiichi site itself. No abnormalities were detected. The plants held. The systems behaved as designed. But the fact that this inspection even happens, automatically and immediately, tells you everything about how Japan now operates, in the shadow of what happened here before. This is not a country that gambles on nuclear safety anymore, not after what it lost. Across the region, train lines stopped. The Tōhoku Shinkansen, that beautiful ribbon of high-speed rail that threads the spine of northern Honshu halted service. Power outages flickered through coastal communities, roads cracked in places. Landslides came down from wet spring hillsides. The immediate damage was real, but it was manageable. This was not a civilization-breaking event. And yet, if you were listening carefully to the language coming from Japanese seismologists in the first hours, you would have noticed something. They were not celebrating the fact that the damage was limited. They were not saying the worst was over. They were saying, almost uniformly, that the public should remain on high alert for the next 7 days. That aftershocks of similar magnitude were possible. That coastal residents should not return to low-lying areas. Why? Because this earthquake did not happen in a random place. It happened along the Japan Trench. The same fault system, the same subduction interface, the same tectonic machine that, on March 11th, 2011, produced a magnitude 9.1 earthquake that killed nearly 20,000 people and melted down 3 nuclear reactor cores. Now let me be precise. This is important. The epicenter today was not in exactly the same spot as the 2011 main shock. It was offset to the north. Different segment, different patch of the fault. So I do not want you to hear me say this is a repeat of 2011. It is not. But it is the same fault family, the same subduction zone, the same mechanism, and that matters because this fault system has a history of doing something very specific before its largest events. It produces a smaller earthquake first, a warning shot that nobody recognizes as a warning until the real one arrives. On March 9th, 2011, a magnitude 7.3 earthquake struck this exact region of the Japan Trench. It was reported as a standalone event. Seismologists logged it, studied it, classified it, and moved on. Coastal residents felt the shaking, watched for a small tsunami, and went back to their lives. 51 hours later, the magnitude 9.1 struck. The 7.3 was the foreshock, and we only knew that in hindsight. In real time, nobody called it. Nobody could call it. Because the science of distinguishing a foreshock from a standalone earthquake in the moment simply does not exist yet. Statistically, the overwhelming majority of magnitude 7 earthquakes are not foreshocks. They are the main event, so when one happens, the default assumption is that it stands alone, but the default assumption was wrong in 2011, and today something hit the same fault system, at roughly the same magnitude with a similar hypocentral depth, in a region where strain has been accumulating for decades. And the question is no longer whether this earthquake caused damage. The damage is being cleaned up. The question is whether this earthquake is the whole story, or whether it is a prologue. I want you to sit with that for a moment, because the tone of this conversation has to shift now. We are not reporting on a disaster that has happened. We are investigating a situation that is still unfolding. The uncertainty itself is the story. And there is one more thing I need to tell you before we go further. The aftershock sequence that began within minutes of the main event is not behaving the way aftershock sequences normally behave. There is something unusual happening in the data right now, something that scientists are watching very, very closely. We have seen this pattern before. Last time, it did not stop here. Part 2. The pattern match nobody can ignore. If you were to pull up a map of the Japan Trench tonight and overlay the rupture zone of the 2011 Tōhoku earthquake with the epicenter of today's event, here is what you would see. The 2011 rupture was a massive elongated patch, roughly 500 kilometers long, running down the subduction interface offshore of Miyagi and Fukushima prefectures. That is where the seafloor slipped by as much as 50 meters in some places. 50 meters. That is a 16-story building of displacement along the interface in a single rupture event. Today's epicenter sits roughly 180 kilometers north of the center of that 2011 rupture zone, still on the Japan Trench, still on the same subduction interface, but offset to the north, in a section that, according to the hazard models used by Japanese researchers and international seismological agencies, has been flagged for years as a region of concern. That is because when the 2011 rupture happened, it did not release all the accumulated stress along the northern Japan Trench. It released the stress in its specific patch, but the segments immediately to the north and south of that patch remained locked, still loaded, still accumulating strain year after year as the Pacific Plate continued to dive beneath Honshu at a rate of about 8 to 9 centimeters per year. And that is where the concept of a fault family comes in. Subduction zones are not single faults. They are networks of connected, interacting segments. When one segment ruptures, it changes the stress state of every segment around it. Sometimes it relieves pressure, sometimes it transfers pressure. And sometimes the segments that did not rupture in the big event become the segments that rupture in the next event, months or years or decades later. The area where today's earthquake occurred sits within what researchers have called a slip deficit zone. It is a stretch of the subduction interface where GPS measurements, geodetic surveys and seismic modelling have all suggested that strain has been accumulating faster than it has been releasing. A debt, if you want to think of it that way. A tectonic debt being slowly built up over decades, waiting for the moment when the rocks can no longer hold. Today's earthquake released some of that debt. How much? We do not yet know. That calculation is still being worked out in real time. But here is what catches the attention of every seismologist looking at this event. The magnitude of today's earthquake, between 7.4 and 7.5, is remarkably close to the magnitude of the 2011 foreshock, which was a 7.3. Now, I want to be careful here, because magnitude similarity alone does not mean anything. Earthquakes of magnitude 7 happen on this fault system with some regularity. A single data point is a coincidence, but human brains are pattern recognition machines. When we see similar magnitudes, similar locations, similar fault systems and similar mechanisms, our brains light up. We notice. And sometimes that noticing is just confirmation bias, the tendency to see patterns that are not really there. But sometimes that noticing is the beginning of genuine insight. The question is, which one is this? The differences matter. Today's event is offset from the 2011 foreshock location, the rupture direction, which will tell us how the fault broke, and in which direction the energy propagated is not yet fully characterized. The stress state of the surrounding segments has changed since 2011, because the 2011 rupture itself rearranged the stress field, so whatever we are looking at now is not a carbon copy of what we saw in March of that year. This is what seismologists call a partial pattern match, not the same fingerprint, but the same hand. And this is why scientists are so carefully avoiding any public statement that draws a direct line between today's event and the 2011 foreshock. Because in real-time seismology, foreshock classification is essentially impossible. The defining characteristic of a foreshock is that it is followed by a larger earthquake. Until that larger earthquake happens, you cannot definitively call the first event a foreshock. It is, by definition, a retrospective classification. So what Japanese scientists can say is this: most magnitude 7 earthquakes along this fault are standalone events. Historically, the base rate of foreshock sequences is low. Probabilistically, the most likely outcome of today's event is that it was the main shock, and what follows will be a gradually decaying sequence of aftershocks. But probability is not the same as certainty, and when you are dealing with a known stress zone, a region already flagged by hazard models as underloaded and unreleased, the probabilities shift, not enormously, not to the point where a larger event becomes likely, but to the point where it becomes non-negligible. And here is the thing about non-negligible probabilities of catastrophic outcomes. They demand attention. A 1% chance of a magnitude 9 earthquake in the next week is not zero. It is not something you ignore. It is something you plan for, prepare for, and watch. That is the posture Japan is in right now. This is not an average earthquake in an average place. This is a major earthquake in a specific segment of a known high-hazard fault system, with statistical and geological fingerprints that resemble, at least in some ways, a sequence that 15 years ago caught the world unprepared. We are looking at pattern recognition under uncertainty. We cannot be sure what we are seeing, but we also cannot afford to look away. And there is one more piece of this puzzle that I need to bring into the picture before we go further, because the aftershock sequence that began within minutes of the main shock is, as I mentioned, doing something unusual. It is not decaying the way aftershock sequences normally decay. It is producing more earthquakes, faster, at shallower depths than we would expect. And if this is a pattern, if this really is the opening move of something larger, then the next 48 hours matter more than the last 15 years of quiet along this coast. Part 3. The aftershock sequence is not behaving normally. Let me tell you about something called Amori's law. I promise I will not get mathematical about it, because the math is not the point. The point is that back in the 1890s, A Japanese seismologist named Fuzakichi Omori noticed something about the behavior of earthquakes after a large event. Aftershocks follow a predictable pattern. Right after the main earthquake, you get a burst of aftershocks. Over time, that burst decays. Fewer and fewer aftershocks occur as the hours and days tick by. The curve drops off. The system settles. It is, in essence, a fault's way of catching its breath. The rocks around the rupture have been violently rearranged. They are now adjusting to their new positions. Every little adjustment produces a small earthquake, and as the adjustments finish, the earthquakes slow down and eventually stop. This is what a healthy aftershock sequence looks like: a sharp spike, followed by a gradual, predictable decline. Now, what is happening right now along the Japan Trench is not that. Within 7 hours of the main shock, the region had recorded more than 14 earthquakes of magnitude 4.5 or greater. That is a lot. That is more than you would expect in the first 7 hours of a typical magnitude 7.5 aftershock sequence, based on historical averages across similar subduction zone events. The distribution we would normally expect would spread those 14+ events across 24 to 48 hours, not 7. That is what we mean when we say the aftershocks are accelerated. And it is not just the total number, it is the magnitudes. Multiple aftershocks have come in at magnitude 5 or greater within hours of the main event. That is also unusually energetic for an early sequence. Aftershock magnitudes are generally supposed to be smaller than the main shock by a predictable margin. You can get 1 or 2 large aftershocks. That is normal. But multiple magnitude 5+ events in rapid succession is a signal that the system is still releasing significant energy, not gently decaying. And then there is one aftershock that really has scientists paying attention: a magnitude 5.6 at a depth of only about 2.2 kilometers below the seafloor. That is extraordinarily shallow. For reference, most aftershocks along a subduction interface occur at depths of 30 to 60 kilometers, because that is where the main interface itself sits. An aftershock at 2.2 kilometers depth is not happening on the main interface. It is happening in the overlying plate, very close to the seafloor, and here is why that matters. Shallow aftershocks, especially shallow offshore aftershocks, have the capacity to generate their own tsunamis. The shallower the slip, the more directly it displaces the water column above, and when you are already in a tsunami warning situation, with evacuated coastal communities still waiting for the all-clear, a shallow near seafloor aftershock is not a statistical curiosity. It is a second potential threat. It also raises a question about the mechanism, because 2.2 kilometers below the seafloor, you are in the domain of what we call splay faults. Splay faults are secondary faults that branch off the main subduction interface and rise up toward the seafloor at a steeper angle. They are notorious in the tsunami literature because they are among the most efficient generators of large tsunami waves, precisely because they displace water so directly. If the aftershock sequence is activating splay faults, that tells us the stress field has not simply been released, it has been redistributed. Pressure has moved from one structure to another. The main rupture may have slipped, but it may have loaded adjacent faults in the process. That is not the behavior of a system that is finishing. That is the behavior of a system that is still negotiating. There is another possibility we have to consider, because scientific integrity demands it. Sometimes, aftershock sequences just behave weirdly. Natural systems have variance. Not every decay curve follows the average. Sometimes a sequence is front-loaded, sometimes it is back-loaded, sometimes it clusters in unexpected ways. The fact that this sequence is energetic does not automatically mean it is a precursor to something larger. It might just be an unusually active but ultimately normal aftershock sequence. I want to be fair to that interpretation, because overclaiming does not serve anyone. The last thing we need is a panic based on a pattern that turns out to be statistical noise. But here is the thing: aftershock sequence behavior is one of the signals that scientists monitor specifically, because in some historical cases, it has preceded larger events. The 2011 foreshock sequence, when you look back at it now, had unusual clustering in the hours and days before the magnitude 9.1. It also had migration. The epicenters of the small earthquakes were moving slowly in a specific direction, toward where the main rupture would eventually begin. So when we see an aftershock sequence right now that is not decaying, that is producing multiple energetic events, that includes shallow near-surface shocks on possible splay faults, We do not have proof of a foreshock. We do not have certainty. But we have a reason to watch. We have a reason to monitor for migration. We have a reason to track whether the hypocenters of successive earthquakes are drifting in any particular direction. We have a reason to hold our breath. Because this doesn't look like a system that's finished speaking, and that brings us back to the central question of tonight. Is this earthquake the story, or is it a chapter? Because if the aftershocks were behaving normally, if the decay curve looked clean, if everything was settling into the expected pattern, I think we would all feel a lot more comfortable putting this in the rearview mirror. But they're not, and we don't. So we keep watching, we keep listening, and we keep asking what the data is trying to tell us. Part 4. The official language versus the real concern. Listen carefully to what Japanese officials are saying in public right now, and you will hear something very specific. You will hear the phrase, "Expect more earthquakes of similar magnitude over the next 7 days." You will hear warnings about landslides in areas where the shaking loosened hillsides. You will hear reminders about secondary tsunami waves and the danger of returning to coastal areas prematurely. What you will not hear is the word foreshock. What you will not hear is any direct acknowledgement that today's event might precede something larger. What you will not hear is the kind of alarm that the actual scientific uncertainty would, if fully communicated, probably warrant. And I want to be clear about something. This is not a cover-up. This is not officials hiding information from the public. This is how modern seismology is supposed to communicate during a high uncertainty situation. The standard advisory language Japan uses after a major earthquake is designed to promote preparedness without causing panic. And for most earthquakes, most of the time, that language is appropriate, because most earthquakes most of the time are not foreshocks. But there is a gap tonight between what the official language conveys and what individual scientists are actually thinking. Because if you talk to researchers who specialize in subduction zone dynamics, who have spent their careers modeling the Japan Trench, who have seen this fault system do what it did in 2011, they are not going home and sleeping soundly tonight. They are watching data feeds, they are checking GPS stations, they are looking at hypocenter distributions. They are asking each other, in careful measured tones, whether what they are seeing right now matches anything historical. This is what we call information asymmetry. The scientists have access to data and interpretive frameworks that the public does not. Not because the data is secret. It is largely available in real time through open seismic networks, but because interpreting that data requires years of specialized training and an intuition for pattern recognition that cannot be easily transferred. So let me walk you through what scientists are actually watching right now, in plain language, so that you are looking at the same signals they are. The first thing they are monitoring is hypocenter migration. Every aftershock has a location in three-dimensional space: latitude, longitude, and depth. If you plot those locations over time, you can see whether the earthquakes are occurring in the same area or drifting somewhere. If they drift, where are they going? Are they moving up dip, towards shallower parts of the fault? Are they moving along strike toward one end of the rupture zone or the other? Are they clustering at a specific boundary, as if piling up against a locked patch that has not yet broken? In 2011, when seismologists reviewed the foreshock sequence in hindsight, they saw migration. They saw small earthquakes drifting in a specific direction before the magnitude 9.1 occurred. That migration, retrospectively, was one of the clearest precursor signals. Tonight, scientists are asking whether today's aftershock sequence shows any migration. It is too early to say definitively. The sequence needs to continue for more hours, probably days, before a clear migration pattern, if one exists, becomes obvious. But every hour, more data comes in and the picture becomes clearer. The second signal they are monitoring is moment release. Moment is a measure of the total energy an earthquake releases. When you add up the moment from the main shock and all the aftershocks, you can ask whether the total energy matches what you would expect from an event of this magnitude, or whether there is more energy still being released than the system should, by its own physics, be producing. Excess moment release can indicate that the rupture was not fully completed, that there is still elastic strain in the rocks that needs to go somewhere. The third signal, and arguably the most important one, is GPS deformation. Across Japan, there is a dense network of GPS stations called GeoNet. Each station tracks its position to millimeter precision in real time. When the ground deforms, whether through earthquake slip or through slow, silent movement, the GPS stations detect it. In the days before some large earthquakes, including the 2011 event, GPS stations have detected what scientists call slow slip events. These are episodes of fault motion that occur so slowly that they do not produce seismic waves that humans can feel or that standard seismometers can easily detect. But they produce measurable ground deformation. The fault is slipping, silently, releasing strain, and sometimes that silent slipping is a precursor to a larger catastrophic rupture. Whether slow slip is occurring right now along the Japan Trench is exactly the kind of question scientists are asking. The GPS data is being analysed in real time, and the answer to that question, if it is clear enough to answer, will be one of the most important pieces of information in determining what happens next. Here is the uncomfortable truth. Deterministic prediction of earthquakes is impossible. We cannot say, with confidence, that a specific earthquake will happen on a specific day in a specific location. The physics of fault systems is too chaotic, too nonlinear, too dependent on microscale properties that we cannot observe directly. Anyone who tells you they can predict earthquakes deterministically is selling something. What we can do is probabilistic forecasting. We can say that the probability of a magnitude 7+ earthquake in a given region over a given time window is elevated or reduced relative to the baseline. Japan uses these probabilistic advisories. They are the current state of the art, and they are being updated in real time based on the data coming in from today's event. But probabilistic forecasts are hard to communicate. They do not give clear yes or no answers, they give odds. And odds can be misunderstood, either as too alarming or not alarming enough, depending on how they are framed. The question of whether today was a foreshock is a probabilistic question that we will only be able to answer with certainty in retrospect. Either a larger earthquake will occur, and today will be reclassified as a foreshock, or no larger earthquake will occur, and today will have been the main shock. We are waiting. And the watching is the story. The answer exists. It is already encoded in the state of the rocks beneath the Pacific, in the pattern of the aftershocks still rippling through the crust, in the microscopic deformations being recorded by GPS stations right now. The answer is there, we just cannot read it yet, and it may not reveal itself until it is too late to matter. Part 5. The Sanriku Coast's Pattern of Catastrophe. There is a stretch of coastline along northeastern Japan, a jagged, beautiful, dangerous stretch that has a name you should know, the Sanriku Coast. It runs along the Pacific side of Aomori, Iwate and Miyagi prefectures. It is a coastline of deep inlets and narrow bays, of fishing villages tucked into coves, of towns that have built their entire lives around the rhythm of the ocean. It is also, statistically, one of the most tsunami-prone stretches of coastline anywhere on Earth. And I mention this because today's earthquake happened directly offshore of this coast, and the tsunami warnings went out for exactly this region. The reason Japan reacted so aggressively, the reason evacuations were immediate, the reason even a 40-centimetre first wave was not allowed to reassure anyone, is that the Sanriku coast has a history that demands respect. In 1896, on June 15th, a magnitude 8.5 earthquake occurred offshore of this coastline. The shaking was, by all historical accounts, relatively mild. People along the coast felt tremors, but not the kind of shaking that would typically trigger tsunami awareness. Fishermen continued their evening routines. Families sat down to dinner. The earthquake had been, by the standards of a country that lives with earthquakes, unremarkable in its felt intensity. Then the ocean withdrew, harbours emptied, and 20 to 40 minutes after the shaking, a tsunami of unprecedented size rolled into the coves of Sanriku. In some places, run-up reached nearly 38 metres. That is a wall of water the height of a 12-storey building. It destroyed entire villages. It killed approximately 22,000 people. This is what seismologists now call a tsunami earthquake. A specific kind of event where the rupture along the fault is relatively slow, producing gentle ground shaking but massive seafloor displacement. The human body feels the earthquake as mild. The ocean feels it as catastrophic. And because the shaking does not scream danger, people do not run, until the water does the screaming for them. In 1933, on March 3rd, this coastline did it again. A magnitude 8.4 earthquake, this time a different mechanism, what we call an outer rise earthquake, meaning it occurred in the outer flex of the Pacific plate rather than on the subduction interface itself. Different geometry, different stress system, but the result was similar: a tsunami that washed over the Sanriku coast, killing approximately 3,000 people, destroying thousands of homes, and reinforcing once again the lesson that this coastline amplifies waves in ways that defy intuition. Why? Part of it is geography. The Sanriku coast is a rear coast, meaning its bays are drowned river valleys. The inlets are narrow and funnel-shaped. When a tsunami wave enters one of these bays, the water piles up. The wave height increases dramatically as the bay narrows. A 2-metre offshore wave can become a 10-metre wave at the head of the bay. The coastline is, in essence, a wave amplifier. That is why tsunami warnings along the Sanriku coast are never taken lightly. That is why a 40-centimetre first wave did not tell anyone that the danger was over today. Because this coastline has a proven capacity to turn modest offshore waves into monsters by the time they reach the villages. And this is where we have to pull back to the central thread. Because the story I am telling you about the Sanriku coast is not a history lesson for its own sake. It is a warning that the coastline itself has, repeatedly throughout recorded history, produced events where the initial signal was misleading, where the felt shaking did not match the eventual disaster, where the first indicators were small and the real threat came later. Today's earthquake happened in exactly this context, a region that has repeatedly produced deceptive precursor events, a coastline that amplifies waves in ways that catch people off guard, a fault system that 15 years ago produced a foreshock that nobody recognized until the main shock arrived 51 hours later. When Japanese authorities reacted aggressively today, they were reacting to this history. They were refusing to make the same mistakes their predecessors made. They were treating every signal as potentially significant, because on this coast, the signals have a way of turning out to mean more than they first appeared. And if that doesn't make you take tonight's uncertainty seriously, I don't know what will. Part 6. The 2011 foreshock sequence revisited. Let us go back to March 9th, 2011, and walk through, in detail, what happened in the days leading up to the Tōhoku earthquake. Because if you want to understand why tonight's event is being taken so seriously, you need to understand exactly what scientists did not see coming 15 years ago. At 11:45 in the morning local time on March 9th, a magnitude 7.3 earthquake struck offshore Miyagi Prefecture. The epicenter was within the Japan Trench subduction zone. The shaking was felt across Tōhoku. A small tsunami warning was issued, and a modest tsunami, around 55 centimeters at its peak, arrived at the coast. Nothing about this event at the time set off alarm bells. It was classified as a standalone earthquake. The Japan Meteorological Agency issued its standard post-earthquake advisory, warning of possible aftershocks. Seismologists logged the event, analysed the mechanism, and began the routine work of characterising the rupture. By March 10th, the public conversation had largely moved on. The earthquake was news for a few hours, and then it was not. Underneath the surface, however, things were not quiet. In the hours and days following the March 9th event, an unusual cluster of smaller earthquakes began to occur in the same region. Not just random aftershocks, but a pattern. Seismologists have since analysed this cluster in extraordinary detail. What they found, in hindsight, was remarkable. The cluster showed migration. The hypercenters of successive earthquakes were drifting slowly toward the southwest, not randomly scattered, moving in a specific direction toward the area where, on March 11th, the magnitude 9.1 main rupture would initiate. There was also evidence from post-hoc analysis of GPS data of a slow slip event occurring along the interface in the hours and days before the main shock. A silent, aseismic motion. The fault was creeping, releasing strain in a way that produced no felt shaking, but that was measurable in retrospect in the ground deformation data. All of these signals, the clustering, the migration, the slow slip, were there. They were recorded, they were in the data, and yet, in real time, nobody identified them as a foreshock sequence leading to an imminent, catastrophic rupture. Why not? Because the signals, individually, were not unique enough. Aftershock clusters happen after most large earthquakes. Migration is not always clear in real time. Slow slip events occur on many subduction zones, most of which do not precede catastrophic ruptures. The pattern was only unambiguous after the magnitude 9.1 had occurred, and scientists went back to look at what had preceded it. This is the great tragedy of foreshock identification. In hindsight, the signs are often obvious. In the moment, they are ambiguous. They are noise that could be signal, or signal that looks like noise, and the difference between the two is often only clear after the main event has already happened. Peer-reviewed studies of the 2011 sequence have estimated that foreshock sequences like this one are rare. They do not precede every large earthquake, but they are also not vanishingly uncommon. In some subduction zone regions, the base rate of foreshock activity is high enough that scientists actively monitor for it. The Japan Trench is one of those regions. So when today's earthquake occurred, in the same fault system, at a magnitude comparable to the 2011 foreshock, with an aftershock sequence that is showing early signs of unusual behaviour, scientists are not asking whether today's event could be a foreshock in some abstract theoretical sense. They are asking whether today's event matches, in observable ways, the specific pattern that preceded the magnitude 9.1 15 years ago. And here is the unsettling thing. They do not yet have enough data to answer that question. The aftershock sequence is only hours old. Migration, if it is going to be visible, will take more time to emerge. Slow slip events, if they are occurring, require careful GPS analysis that cannot be done in real time with full confidence. We are right now in the window where, in 2011, the foreshock sequence was unfolding but had not yet been recognised. We are in the moment before retrospective clarity. We are watching the same kind of signals that existed in March of that year, and we do not yet know whether they mean what they meant then. The 2011 foreshock was only understood after catastrophe. Tonight, we have the opportunity to watch a possibly similar situation in real time, with our eyes open, with the lessons of history available to us. Whether that opportunity translates into better outcomes, we cannot know yet. But the awareness itself is something. It is the difference between being blindsided and being braced, and right now Japan is braced. Part 7. The Unreleased Energy Problem. I want to introduce you to a concept that seismologists use when they think about faults like the Japan Trench. It is called slip deficit, and it is, in many ways, the central idea that makes tonight's uncertainty so serious. Here is how it works. Tectonic plates are always moving. They do not stop. The Pacific plate is sliding under Honshu at about 8 to 9 centimeters per year. Every decade, every century. That motion does not halt just because an earthquake happens. The plates keep moving, and the subduction interface between them, the place where they meet, has to accommodate that motion somehow. Most of the time, the interface is locked. The two plates are stuck together. The Pacific plate is pushing, but the rocks on the interface are holding the North American plate in place. The plate motion is still happening, but instead of producing slip along the interface, it is producing strain. Elastic deformation. Think of it like bending a stick. The stick is being forced to bend, but it is not breaking yet. It is storing the energy of the bending as strain. Every year, the strain builds up a little more, a few centimeters worth. Over decades, it becomes meters. Over centuries, it can become tens of meters. And eventually, when the stress exceeds the strength of the rocks on the interface, the fault slips. The stored strain is released as an earthquake. The bigger the accumulated strain, the bigger the potential earthquake. Slip deficit is the technical term for the difference between how much the plates should have slipped, based on the plate motion rate, and how much they actually have slipped through earthquakes and other processes. If a fault has a slip deficit of 10 meters, that means it is 10 meters behind where it should be. 10 meters of slip is owed, and that debt will eventually be paid in the form of an earthquake or a sequence of earthquakes. Now, here is the important part for tonight. The 2011 Tōhoku earthquake released an enormous amount of slip deficit, but only along its specific rupture patch. The segments of the Japan Trench immediately to the north of that patch did not slip in 2011. They remained locked. They continued to accumulate strain. And in the 15 years since, they have continued to accumulate. Some hazard models have estimated the slip deficit in the northern Japan Trench segments at several meters. That is not enough by itself to produce a magnitude 9 earthquake, but it is enough to produce a magnitude 8. And in combination with potential rupture of multiple segments together, a cascading failure, it could produce something even larger. Today's earthquake occurred in this slip deficit zone, and the question that is paralyzing scientists tonight is whether today's event released a significant portion of that accumulated strain, or whether it released only a small portion and in the process transferred stress to the neighbouring locked segments, pushing them closer to their own failure point. This is the core of what makes tonight's uncertainty so much heavier than a typical post-earthquake analysis, because if today's event reduced the slip deficit, then the system is in a safer state tonight than it was yesterday. The tectonic debt has been partially paid. The probability of a larger event in the near term is lower. But if today's event did not significantly reduce the slip deficit, and instead, through the mechanism of stress transfer, moved stress into adjacent locked segments, then the system is in a more dangerous state tonight than it was yesterday. The debt has not been paid, and one of the neighbouring segments is now closer to its own rupture threshold than it was before. We do not know yet which of these scenarios is true. The modelling takes time. The GPS analysis takes time. The aftershock sequence needs to play out further before scientists can estimate how much of the stress has been released versus transferred. In the meantime, we are living inside the ambiguity. We do not know if the system just exhaled or inhaled. We do not know if the crust is relaxing or tightening. We do not know if tonight is the end of the story or the middle of it. And this is not a knowable thing on a human timescale of hours. The modelling will take days, perhaps weeks, to mature. The aftershock sequence needs to fully develop. Only with the benefit of more data will we be able to say whether this event made the region safer or more dangerous. There is a concept in physics called stress shadow. When a fault ruptures, the area immediately around the rupture often enters a state of reduced stress. The slip has relieved pressure locally. For a period of time, that region is in a stress shadow, less likely to produce another earthquake because the stored strain has been dropped. But outside the shadow, on the margins of the rupture, stress is often increased. This is called stress loading. The rupture that released pressure in one place has pushed pressure outward onto the segments that did not rupture. And those segments, if they were already loaded, can be pushed closer to failure. Whether the segments adjacent to today's rupture are in a stress shadow or experiencing stress loading depends on details of the rupture that we do not yet fully characterize. The direction of slip, the specific portion of the interface that moved, the exact magnitude of the displacement, all of these factors affect the stress transfer calculation. This is why the immediate days after a major earthquake like this one are so critical. Scientists are racing to characterize the rupture, model the stress transfer, and assess whether neighbouring segments have been pushed forward or pulled back on the clock. The answer determines whether the aftermath of this event is returned to normal or the build-up to something worse. Right now, we do not have the answer. We have only the question. And the question is echoing through every seismology lab in Japan tonight. Did this earthquake empty a reservoir, or did it fill one? Part 8. The geometry that controls everything. If you want to understand why the location of this earthquake matters so much, you have to understand something fundamental about subduction zone geometry. Not all parts of a subduction interface are created equal. The behaviour of the fault depends on where along it the slip occurs. The subduction interface extends from the trench, where the Pacific plate begins to dive beneath Honshu, all the way down to depths of 50, 60, 70 kilometers below the surface. At the shallow end near the trench, the interface is at depths of maybe 10 to 15 kilometers below the seafloor. At the deep end, it extends far inland under the continental crust of Honshu. The shallow portion of the interface, what we call the up-dip section, and the deep portion, the down-dip section, behave very differently during earthquakes, and the difference is especially important when you are asking about tsunami generation. When a subduction interface ruptures in its up-dip section, close to the trench, the slip occurs underwater, in a location where the seafloor is free to move vertically without much constraint. If the fault slips significantly in the up-dip section, the seafloor itself rises or falls, displacing the column of water directly above it. That displacement is the source of a tsunami. Up-dip ruptures are efficient tsunami generators because they transfer their energy so directly into the ocean. The shallower the rupture, the more direct the coupling with the water column, and the larger the tsunami for a given magnitude of earthquake. Down-dip ruptures, in contrast, occur under the continental crust, where the energy is absorbed and dampened by the overlying rock. They produce strong shaking inland but typically generate smaller tsunamis because the slip does not directly displace the sea. Today's earthquake, based on the initial location data, appears to have occurred in the up-dip portion of the interface. It was shallow, it was offshore, it was close to the trench, and these are exactly the conditions that maximize tsunami generating potential. There is another layer of complexity here. Within the up-dip region, there are structures called splay faults, which I mentioned briefly earlier. Splay faults branch off the main interface and extend upward at steeper angles, often reaching close to the seafloor. When a splay fault slips, it produces even more direct vertical displacement of the seafloor than a slip on the main interface at the same depth. Splay faults are considered among the most dangerous tsunami generators on any subduction zone. They are short, sharp, and highly efficient at displacing water, and recent research has suggested that some of the largest tsunamis in historical subduction zone events may have been amplified by splay fault activation during the main rupture. Whether today's earthquake involves splay fault activation is one of the questions scientists are trying to answer right now. The shallow aftershock I mentioned earlier, the magnitude 5.6 at 2.2 kilometers depth, is exactly the kind of event you might expect if a splay fault system is active in the area. It is not proof, but it is consistent with the possibility. The mechanism of today's earthquake, meaning the specific orientation and direction of the fault slip, is still being determined. Seismologists use a technique called moment tensor analysis to characterize the mechanism from the waveforms recorded by distant seismic stations. This analysis is not instantaneous. It takes hours, sometimes days, to mature. And in those hours, the specific mechanism of the event is a key piece of information that has not yet been finalized. There is another possibility we have to consider, which is that today's event was not a subduction interface rupture at all, but an outer rise earthquake. Outer rise earthquakes occur in the Pacific plate itself, not on the interface. They happen where the plate is flexing as it approaches the trench, and they typically have a different mechanism, with extension rather than compression. The 1933 Sanriku earthquake was an outer rise event, and it produced a devastating tsunami. If today's event was an outer rise earthquake, rather than a megathrust event, the implications are different. Outer rise events do not directly release slip deficit on the subduction interface. They reflect stress in the Pacific plate itself, but they can still trigger tsunamis, and they can also, in some models, be associated with changes in the stress state of the interface below. Until the moment tensor is fully determined, we're operating with uncertainty about the basic mechanism, and that uncertainty ripples outward into every subsequent question. What did this event release? What did it transfer? What does it mean for adjacent segments? Where this broke may matter more than how big it was. A magnitude 7.5 up dip on the interface with splay fault activation is a very different event from a magnitude 7.5 in the outer rise. Both are tsunami capable. Both are serious. But their implications for the longer-term hazard and for the probability of what comes next are not the same. And this is why, when you read news reports that cite just the magnitude and the depth, you're getting only a sliver of the information that scientists are actually working with. The magnitude tells you the energy, the depth tells you how shallow, but the mechanism, the direction, the exact structures involved, these are what tell you what the event means, and we are still working to tell. Part 9. The clustering problem. Let me take you back in time, just a few months, to December of 2025, because something happened then that, until today, was treated as an isolated event. But after tonight, it is being re-examined. In December, a magnitude 7.6 earthquake struck near Aomori, in northern Honshu. It was offshore, it was within the Japan Trench system, and it produced a tsunami warning. The warning was eventually lifted, damage was limited, and the event was logged as a major but routine earthquake on one of the world's most active fault systems. That was 4 to 5 months ago. The long-term average interval between magnitude 7+ earthquakes in the Japan Trench region, based on decades of historical data, is approximately 16 months. Major events happen, on average, a little more than once per year, but with significant variability around that average. 2 magnitude 7+ events within 5 months is not extraordinary. It has happened before, but it is on the shorter side of the distribution. It represents a tighter clustering than the long-term average would predict. And when you see clustering in earthquake occurrence, it raises a specific question. Is the clustering random, or is it meaningful? Random clustering is a real phenomenon in statistics. If you flip a coin 100 times, you will occasionally get long runs of heads or tails by pure chance. The human brain tends to perceive these runs as meaningful, but often they are not. earthquake sequences can show similar random clustering. Short intervals between events do not automatically indicate any underlying cause, but sometimes clustering is meaningful. Sometimes one earthquake influences the stress state of a region in ways that increase the probability of another earthquake in the near term. This is well documented in seismology. Large earthquakes are often followed by elevated rates of activity not just in aftershocks, but in other related events on nearby faults. The system becomes active. It enters a phase of elevated activity, and that phase can last for months or years before returning to baseline. The question tonight is whether the Japan Trench is in such a phase, whether the December event and today's event and the aftershock sequence we are now watching are all expressions of a connected period of activation. If they are, then the stress state of the region is elevated, and the probability of another major event in the near term is higher than the long-term average would suggest. Statistical analyses of historical earthquake clustering in subduction zones have produced mixed results. Some studies have found clear evidence of temporal clustering, with periods of elevated activity separated by longer periods of quiet. Other studies have found that most apparent clustering is consistent with random variation around the long-term average. The scientific community has not reached a uniform consensus on how much meaning to extract from clustering signals. But in specific cases, especially in well-monitored fault systems with dense data, clustering can be diagnostic. It can suggest that a region is in an active phase, that stress is being redistributed among segments, that the system has not yet returned to equilibrium after a recent major event. The Japan Trench, since 2011, has been in a prolonged period of post-rupture adjustment. The main rupture released enormous stress, but the stress field around it has been evolving ever since, with aftershocks, smaller earthquakes, slow slip events, and ongoing deformation. 15 years later, the system has not fully returned to its pre-rupture state. It is still adjusting, still negotiating. In that context, the December event and today's event may or may not be connected to each other. They occurred in somewhat different segments, with different mechanisms, and the direct stress interaction between them is uncertain. But they are occurring within a fault system that is still in a period of adjustment from the largest rupture in its recorded history, and that context alone makes their clustering worth examining. This is why scientists are not just analysing today's event in isolation. They are analysing it in the context of the broader seismic cycle of the Japan Trench. They are asking whether the recent pattern of activity fits the expected behaviour of a fault system 15 years after a magnitude 9 rupture, or whether it is deviating in ways that suggest something unusual is happening. The question that comes out of this framing is uncomfortable, but it is real. What if this is not a single event? What if it is not even two events? What if we are in a phase of the seismic cycle where the system is attempting to redistribute stress through a series of major ruptures, and we are witnessing the early steps of that redistribution? This would not mean a magnitude 9 is imminent. It would not mean catastrophe is around the corner. But it would mean that the probability of another major event in the coming months is elevated, and that the long-term pattern of quiet interrupted by occasional major earthquakes may, for now, be giving way to a more active pattern. We cannot tell from inside this phase whether this is what is happening. Only the passage of time and the observation of what comes next will tell us. But the question is not dismissible. It is one of the frames through which scientists are looking at tonight's data. This may not be one event, it may be a phase. Part 10: Stress Transfer and Segment Interaction. There is a concept in seismology that sounds almost mundane when you first hear it, but has profound implications once you understand it. It is called static stress transfer, and it is the physical mechanism by which one earthquake influences the probability of another earthquake nearby. When a fault ruptures, it physically moves the rocks on either side of it. The rocks on one side slip in one direction, the rocks on the other side slip in the opposite direction. This movement is not confined to the fault itself. It propagates outward through the surrounding crust, changing the stress state of the rocks in every direction around the rupture. Some regions around the rupture experience a decrease in shear stress. These are regions where the fault motion relieved pressure. Other regions experience an increase in shear stress. These are regions where the fault motion added pressure. And the pattern of increases and decreases is not random. It is determined by the geometry of the rupture and the orientation of the surrounding faults. Scientists quantify these changes using a concept called Coulomb stress change. Without getting into the equations, the idea is this. For every fault in the vicinity of a rupture, you can calculate whether the rupture made that fault more likely to slip or less likely to slip. If the stress change is positive, meaning the fault is pushed closer to failure, we say the rupture loaded the fault. If the stress change is negative, meaning the fault is pushed away from failure, we say the rupture relaxed it. The Coulomb stress change calculation is one of the most important tools seismologists use to assess the implications of a major earthquake for surrounding faults, and it is being applied right now to today's event. The question is straightforward to state, but complex to answer. Did today's earthquake load any of the neighbouring fault segments along the Japan Trench? If yes, which ones, and by how much? The answer depends on details of today's rupture that are still being characterised, the exact direction of slip, the specific portion of the interface that moved, the spatial distribution of the slip, whether it was concentrated in one spot or spread across a broader area. These details matter because the stress transfer pattern depends on them. Early preliminary analyses, based on the available data, are being circulated among the international seismological community. Those analyses are not yet public, but the questions they are addressing are clear. Segments immediately north and south of today's rupture are being evaluated for potential loading. The interface segments closest to the 2011 rupture zone are being evaluated. The outer rise region is being evaluated. Each one is a potential target for increased probability of future rupture, depending on how today's event redistributed stress. This is the concept of cascading failure. One earthquake loads a neighbouring fault. That neighbouring fault, now closer to failure, ruptures sometime later. That rupture in turn loads yet another fault. And in the worst case scenarios, you can get a sequence of major earthquakes rippling through a fault system as each rupture pushes the next one over the edge. Cascading failure has been observed in various regions of the world. The North Anatolian Fault in Turkey is one classic example, where a sequence of major earthquakes in the 20th century progressed along the fault in a pattern that many seismologists have interpreted as a stress transfer cascade. Each earthquake loaded the next segment, which ruptured within a few years or decades. Subduction zones can also experience cascading behaviour, though the pattern is less clear because the segments interact in more complex three-dimensional geometries. The question of whether the Japan Trench could experience a cascading sequence of major earthquakes and whether today's event is part of such a sequence is one that will be debated in the scientific community for years to come. What we can say tonight with some confidence is that today's earthquake has changed the stress state of the Japan Trench region, not in a way that is immediately visible to the public, not in a way that shows up on the news tickers, but in a way that seismologists can calculate, and that they are calculating right now. The results of those calculations will, over the coming days and weeks, begin to inform the probabilistic hazard assessments for the region. If the calculations show significant loading of adjacent segments, the probability estimates for those segments will be revised upward. If they show minimal loading, the estimates will remain near baseline. There is a limit to what the calculations can tell us though. Coulomb stress change calculations are based on simplified models of elastic rock behaviour. Real fault systems have complexities that the models do not fully capture. The calculations can tell us whether the stress change is positive or negative, but they cannot tell us definitively whether that change is enough to trigger failure in the near term. The change is essentially a push. Whether the neighbouring fault was already on the verge of failure and just needed a push, or whether it was far from failure and the push made only a marginal difference, is a question that requires knowledge of the fault's current state that we generally do not have with precision. Earthquakes don't happen alone, they happen in conversation. Every rupture speaks to the faults around it in the language of stress transfer, and some of those conversations are quiet and inconsequential. Some of them are urgent and consequential. Which category tonight's conversation falls into, we cannot yet fully say, but the conversation is happening. The Japan Trench is talking to itself right now, and we are listening as carefully as we know how. Part 11. Ring of Fire Context. If you pull back from the Japan Trench and look at the Pacific Basin as a whole today, you will see something that some people on social media are already commenting on. There were several moderate earthquakes today in other parts of the Ring of Fire, a magnitude 5+ near the Kermadec Islands, activity in parts of Indonesia, tremors in other subduction zones around the Pacific Rim. Does this mean anything? Is the whole ring of fire activating at once? The honest scientific answer is almost certainly not in any direct causal sense. The ring of fire is enormous. It contains roughly 75% of the world's active volcanoes and generates approximately 90% of the world's earthquakes. On any given day, there is significant seismic activity somewhere along the ring. Finding a cluster of moderate earthquakes across the Pacific in a 24-hour window is not unusual. It is statistically the norm rather than the exception. Moreover, the distances involved are too large for direct stress transfer between, say, Japan and New Zealand. The concept of Coulomb's stress change falls off rapidly with distance. At distances of thousands of kilometers, the stress change from one earthquake on a fault in another region is negligible. There is no known physical mechanism by which a magnitude 7.5 in Japan would meaningfully load a fault in the Kermadec Islands. The appearance of synchronized activity is, in most cases, a cognitive artifact. When we are primed to pay attention to earthquakes, because one has just made the news, we notice other earthquakes that we would normally ignore. Selection bias makes the pattern appear more significant than it is. That said, the Ring of Fire is a single interconnected tectonic system in the broadest sense. The Pacific Plate is a single entity, and its motion affects every subduction zone along its margins. Over very long timescales, there are correlations in activity across the ring that geologists have studied, but those correlations operate on timescales of millennia, not days. They are not relevant to interpreting any given 24-hour window. So when you see social media posts tonight suggesting that Japan's earthquake is part of a larger Ring of Fire event, take those with a grain of salt. The global context of seismic activity is a kind of contextual texture, useful for framing the broader tectonic environment, but not evidence of coordinated activity. What matters tonight is not what is happening at other subduction zones around the Pacific. What matters is what is happening in this one. The Japan Trench, the Tōhoku coast, the segments immediately north and south of the 2011 rupture. That is where the story is. That is where the question of tonight's central uncertainty plays out. Ring of Fire activity elsewhere is backdrop, not signal. The focus remains whether this specific system is escalating. Part 12. The Cascadia Shadow. There is another subduction zone that I have to briefly mention, not because it is directly related to tonight's event, but because it is a conceptual mirror. The Cascadia subduction zone runs along the Pacific coast of North America, from northern California through Oregon and Washington into British Columbia. It is in many ways the Western Hemisphere's analogue to the Japan Trench. Cascadia is a subduction zone where the Juan de Fuca Plate is diving beneath the North American plate. It has produced massive earthquakes in the past. The last major rupture of the Cascadia interface occurred in January of 1700, producing a magnitude 9 class earthquake and a tsunami that crossed the Pacific and caused damage in Japan. Geological evidence of past Cascadia ruptures suggests a recurrence interval of several hundred years, meaning the fault is, geologically speaking, overdue for another major event. The parallel to Japan is obvious. Both fault systems are megathrust subduction zones. Both are capable of magnitude 9 earthquakes. Both pose serious tsunami hazards to densely populated coastlines. Both are monitored closely, and both are subject to the same kinds of hazard assessments and probabilistic forecasts. I mention Cascadia tonight not to suggest that what is happening in Japan has any direct implications for the Cascadia region. The two fault systems are separated by thousands of kilometers of Pacific Ocean. They do not share stress. They do not communicate in any meaningful physical sense. But Cascadia matters as a reminder that the kind of event we are worrying about in Japan tonight is not a peculiarly Japanese problem. It is a feature of megathrust subduction zones in general. Any of them, anywhere in the world, could produce a magnitude 9 class earthquake. Any of them could produce a foreshock sequence that is not recognized as a foreshock in real time. Any of them could, tomorrow or next year or next century, become the focus of the kind of anxious monitoring that is happening in Japan tonight. The behavior of the Japan Trench 15 years ago, and potentially today, is a type of system failure. It is not an isolated anomaly. It is a category of event that has happened before in other subduction zones, and will happen again somewhere in our lifetimes. Understanding what is happening tonight is not just about Japan, it's about how we, as a civilization, live on a planet with megathrust faults. Cascadia will eventually have its own night like tonight. The people in Portland and Seattle and Vancouver will sit at home watching news feeds and wondering whether a magnitude 7 somewhere offshore is the whole story or a chapter. The uncertainty that Japan is experiencing right now is a dress rehearsal for conversations that will happen someday in the cities of the Pacific Northwest. So what is happening in Japan tonight is not an isolated curiosity. It is a preview, and the lessons we learn from watching Japan navigate this uncertainty, whether the feared larger event occurs or not, will inform how other societies handle similar moments in the future. The behaviour seen here represents a kind of challenge that any megathrust fault can pose, and that the world will increasingly have to learn how to meet. Part 13. The Space Weather Correlation. Now I want to turn to something that, depending on who you ask, is either a genuine emerging scientific question or a speculative fringe idea. It depends on which researcher you talk to, which papers you read, and how much weight you put on statistical correlations versus established physical mechanisms. Approximately 23 hours before today's earthquake, a G2 geomagnetic storm hit Earth. For those unfamiliar with the scale, G2 is a moderate geomagnetic storm, the second tier on a 5-point scale. It was associated with elevated solar wind speeds and increased electron flux in the Earth's magnetosphere. Aurora displays were visible at lower latitudes than usual. Satellite operators adjusted orbits to account for atmospheric drag changes. The usual protocol. Now, the question. Does a G2 geomagnetic storm have anything to do with an earthquake that happens 23 hours later on the opposite side of the planet? The mainstream seismological answer is, no established mechanism exists that would connect the two. Earthquakes are the result of stress accumulated over decades or centuries in the Earth's crust. They are triggered by internal tectonic processes, not external electromagnetic ones. The energy density of a geomagnetic storm, even a strong one, is minuscule compared to the energy density of a fault that is ready to rupture. The idea that space weather could trigger an earthquake from this perspective is essentially a magnitude mismatch. But there is a research community growing in recent years that has been studying statistical correlations between space weather events and earthquake occurrence. Some of these studies have found suggestive correlations, meaning earthquakes occur slightly more frequently in certain time windows following geomagnetic disturbances than would be expected by chance alone. Other studies have found no such correlation. The field is contested. The proposed physical mechanism for researchers who take the correlation seriously is something called capacitive coupling. The basic idea is that geomagnetic storms induce electric currents in the Earth's crust. Those currents can affect the stress state or the pore fluid behaviour of faults that are already close to failure. The storm does not cause the earthquake in any direct sense. It does not create the energy. The energy was already there. But the storm, the hypothesis goes, might be a trigger. It might provide a small perturbation that pushes a fault over the edge, when the fault was already on the verge of rupturing anyway. This is an important distinction. Trigger is not the same as cause. A gun's trigger does not cause the bullet's energy. The energy comes from the gunpowder. The trigger just releases it. In the same way, a geomagnetic storm, if it has any effect at all, would only be a release mechanism for energy that tectonic processes had already loaded into the fault. Whether this mechanism actually operates in nature is genuinely unclear. The statistical correlations are suggestive but not conclusive. The physical mechanism is plausible, but not rigorously demonstrated. Different researchers reach different conclusions depending on how they structure their analyses and what datasets they use. The G2 storm before today's earthquake on its own is not evidence of anything. One data point is anecdote, not pattern. And a correlation between two events separated by 23 hours, when hundreds of earthquakes happen globally every day, is easy to produce by random chance alone. But tonight, as we sit with the uncertainty of whether the fault system in the Japan Trench is escalating or stabilising, the question of whether external factors might have played any role in today's event is hovering at the edge of the scientific conversation. It is not central. It is not the main frame. But it is there as a reminder that the Earth does not exist in isolation, and that the systems we model when we try to predict earthquakes may be influenced by factors we do not fully understand. I want to be careful here, because overclaiming a solar seismic connection would be irresponsible. The evidence is not there to support a direct causal claim. What we have is a suggestive correlation in some studies, a plausible mechanism that has not been firmly established, and a single coincidence tonight that, in the absence of a broader pattern, is just a coincidence. But we are also, tonight, in a situation where the fault system is stressed, where a major earthquake has just occurred, and where a possible trigger, whatever its mechanism or lack thereof, preceded the event by roughly a day. If this is part of a foreshock sequence, and if external triggers do play any role in earthquake initiation, then the G2 storm layered onto an already stressed system is at least worth noting. The central question remains unresolved. Was today's earthquake a main shock or a foreshock? The answer does not depend on the space weather correlation, but the correlation is part of the contextual texture tonight, a reminder that the uncertainty we're sitting with is not just about what happens inside the Earth, but also, possibly, about what happens above it. Part 14. Why scientists don't dismiss it entirely. Before we move on, I want to address something directly. You might be wondering why I am even bringing up the space weather correlation, if the mainstream scientific consensus is that no established mechanism connects geomagnetic storms to earthquakes. Isn't that just giving oxygen to fringe ideas? Here is my answer. Science, when it is working well, does not dismiss ideas simply because they are unconventional. It evaluates them based on evidence. And the evaluation of the solar seismic correlation is still ongoing. There are peer-reviewed papers in reputable journals that have examined the question. There are researchers at respected institutions who continue to study it. The question has not been settled by fiat. It is being worked out through the normal processes of scientific inquiry. What has been demonstrated is that the default assumption that geomagnetic storms have no effect on earthquakes is the safer bet statistically. Most studies find no significant correlation. The correlations that have been claimed are often small, context-dependent, and not reproduced in all datasets. This is why the mainstream consensus leans towards skepticism. But skepticism in science is not the same as dismissal. Scientists remain open to the possibility that new mechanisms may be discovered. If, over the next decade, enough data accumulates to show a robust statistical correlation, the research community will update. That is how science works. It does not close doors permanently, it closes them based on evidence, and it reopens them if the evidence changes. The distinction between correlation and causation is key here. Even if a correlation between space weather and earthquake timing is eventually established, establishing a causal mechanism is a separate and much harder step. You would need to show not only that the two are statistically linked, but that there is a physical pathway connecting them. That pathway has not been demonstrated with the kind of rigour that would satisfy most geophysicists. So the current state of the science is roughly this. The mainstream view is that space weather does not meaningfully affect earthquake occurrence. A minority of researchers disagrees based on statistical analyses and argues that subtle triggering effects may exist. The question is open, in the sense that no one has conclusively closed it, but the weight of evidence currently favours the mainstream view. Tonight, as we sit with the uncertainty of what the Japan Trench is doing, this is part of the context. Even fringe ideas arise because the system's behaviour is not fully understood. The fact that we are even considering whether external triggers might be relevant tells you something about how much we do not yet know. If we fully understood earthquake initiation, there would be no room for speculation about space weather. The room exists precisely because the understanding is incomplete. Part 15. Conspiracy theories, briefly debunked. Whenever a major earthquake happens, a certain category of claims inevitably surfaces on social media. I am going to address the most common ones briefly, not because they deserve extended engagement, but because it is worth being clear about why they are not credible. The first is the HAARP claim. HAARP, the High Frequency Active Auroral Research Program, is a real research facility in Alaska that studies the ionosphere using powerful radio transmissions. Conspiracy theories have long attributed earthquake-causing capabilities to HAARP, claiming that the facility can trigger seismic events through electromagnetic manipulation of the atmosphere or crust. The energy mismatch here is staggering. HAARP's total transmitted power is on the order of megawatts. A magnitude 7.5 earthquake releases energy on the order of petajoules, roughly 100 billion times the total energy HAARP can radiate in an hour. Even if every joule HARP has ever transmitted were somehow concentrated into triggering a fault, it would fall many orders of magnitude short of what is required to influence a subduction interface. The HARP as earthquake weapon claim is, quite simply, a physics problem. The numbers do not add up. The second category is the lunar or planetary alignment claim. The idea is that gravitational forces from the moon or from planetary alignments can trigger earthquakes by imposing tidal stresses on the Earth. This one has a kernel of scientific truth in it. Tidal stresses from the moon do exist, and they do affect the Earth's crust in small ways. Some studies have found very weak correlations between tidal cycles and earthquake occurrence in certain contexts, but the effect where it exists at all is small and inconsistent, and no planetary alignment produces stresses significantly different from the routine tidal stresses that occur every day. Planetary alignments are not credible earthquake triggers in any meaningful sense. The third category is the nuclear timing claim, which surfaces whenever an earthquake occurs near a nuclear facility or at a time of geopolitical tension. The suggestion is that earthquakes are somehow engineered in connection with nuclear tests or other classified activities. Underground nuclear tests do produce seismic signals, but those signals are readily distinguishable from natural earthquakes in terms of their waveform characteristics. A magnitude 7.5 natural subduction zone earthquake cannot be mistaken for a nuclear detonation by any competent seismologist. The waveforms are not similar, the depth distributions are not similar, the energy partitioning is not similar. This claim does not survive basic scientific scrutiny either. I am not going to spend more time on these than they deserve. Each one is, in its own way, an attempt to impose human agency on a phenomenon that is genuinely natural and driven by planetary-scale tectonic processes that no human system can meaningfully influence. But I will note this. The reason these claims attract attention is that the real uncertainty around earthquakes is so profound, and the real answer so elusive, that the human mind naturally reaches for alternative explanations. When we cannot predict, cannot prevent, cannot fully understand, the temptation is to attribute agency where there is none, to say that someone must be doing this, because no one can accept that no one is. Real uncertainty creates space for false explanations. But the real question remains unresolved. The tectonic machinery beneath Japan is doing what it has always done, at timescales that dwarf human history, and the question of whether tonight is a main shock or a foreshock has nothing to do with HARP, or the moon, or classified weapons programs. It has to do with the stress state of the rocks beneath the Pacific, and with the patterns of their release, which we do not yet fully know how to read. Part 16. The Real Unknowns Science Admits. Let me now list, as plainly as I can, the things that we genuinely do not know tonight. These are not fringe uncertainties. These are not speculative ambiguities. These are the core epistemic gaps that every responsible seismologist will acknowledge if you ask them directly. First, we do not know whether today's earthquake increased or decreased the net risk of a larger event in the near term. This is the fundamental question. The event released some stress. It may also have transferred stress. The balance between those two effects, which determines whether the fault system is now in a safer or more dangerous state, cannot be determined from currently available data. It requires modelling that has not yet been completed. Second, we do not know the precise direction in which the rupture propagated. Moment tensor analyses are still in progress. Whether the rupture moved north, south, up dip or down dip matters for the stress transfer calculation. Different propagation directions would load different neighbouring segments. Without a clear characterisation of the rupture direction, the stress transfer analysis cannot be finalised. Third, we do not know whether any slow slip activity is currently occurring along the interface. The GPS data is being analysed. Slow slip, if present, would indicate that the fault is still releasing strain, silently, and could be either a precursor to a larger event or, alternatively, a sign that the system is gently relaxing. The interpretation depends on the details, and the details are not yet clear. Fourth, we do not know whether the aftershock sequence will continue to behave unusually, or whether it will settle into a more conventional decay pattern. Some aftershock sequences start energetically and then stabilise. Others start energetically and continue to be energetic, indicating ongoing system activity. Which of these patterns today's sequence will follow is something that will only become clear over the coming hours and days. Fifth, we do not know whether today's earthquake is statistically independent of the December 2025 event, or whether the two are connected through some form of stress interaction or period of elevated activity. Statistical analyses of clustering take time, and the question of meaningful versus random clustering cannot be answered from just two events. Sixth, we do not know whether external factors, including but not limited to the G2 geomagnetic storm that preceded the event, played any role. The mainstream view is that external factors are not significant, but the research is ongoing, and we cannot definitively rule out small triggering effects. These are the unknowns that science admits. They are not failures of science, they are the frontiers of it. Each one is being actively investigated with tools and methods that did not exist 20 years ago, and answers will emerge over time. But tonight, in the immediate aftermath of the event, there are genuine gaps in our understanding. And this is what makes tonight's situation so unusual. We have more data than we have ever had about a subduction zone event. We have dense seismic networks, real-time GPS monitoring, seafloor pressure sensors, and satellite-based geodetic measurements. We are not data poor, we are data rich. We are drowning in data, in fact. But data is not the same as understanding. You can have all the data in the world, and if you do not yet know how to interpret it, the data will not tell you what you want to know. The gap between observation and comprehension is, in seismology, real and wide. We can see what is happening. We cannot always tell what it means. This is what philosophers call epistemic uncertainty. Not uncertainty about the world, but uncertainty about our ability to know the world. The rocks beneath the Pacific have already decided what they are going to do next. The decision is already made, encoded in the current stress state of the system. We just cannot read it yet. The answer is there, but the reading of it is beyond our current capabilities, and this is the hardest part of tonight. Not that we are missing data, not that we are missing tools, but that we are missing the answer, despite having more data and more tools than any generation before us. The question of whether today was a foreshock will be answered, either by what comes next or by what does not come at all. But we cannot force the answer to reveal itself. We can only wait and watch and hope that our preparations are sufficient for whichever outcome emerges. We are not missing the data, we are missing the answer. Part 17. The 48-hour psychological threshold. Here is something I want you to sit with. In March of 2011, the gap between the magnitude 7.3 foreshock and the magnitude 9.1 main shock was 51 hours. 2 days and 3 hours. Not an instant and not a long delay. A specific measurable window of time during which the signals of the impending catastrophe were present in the data, but not recognized. 51 hours. If you project that onto today, the 48 to 72 hour window following today's event becomes, psychologically, a kind of threshold. If a larger earthquake were going to occur in anything like the 2011 pattern, it would most likely happen within that window. Past the window, the probability drops off, because the longer the time since the initial event, the less likely it is that the initial event was a foreshock. I want to be very careful with this framing, because I do not want to suggest that there is a literal clock ticking down to catastrophe. There is not. Every earthquake is different. The 51-hour gap in 2011 was specific to that sequence. Other foreshock sequences in other subduction zones have had different gaps. Some have been shorter, some have been longer. The idea that 48 to 72 hours represents a hard deadline for foreshock behavior is not supported by the data. But psychologically, the number has power. When people know that 15 years ago, in this exact fault system, the gap between the foreshock and the main shock was roughly 2 days, the next 2 days after tonight's event are going to feel different. The watching will be more intense, the attention will be tighter, every aftershock will be scrutinized, every piece of new data will be examined, and that is not irrational, it is prudent. If you're going to be vigilant for a larger event following today's earthquake, the window immediately after is the period of highest relative risk, even if the absolute risk remains low in any given hour. Media and experts have been grappling with how to frame this window tonight. Some are discussing it directly, noting the 2011 precedent. Others are avoiding the specific framing, preferring to emphasize the general 7-day advisory that Japanese authorities typically issue after major earthquakes. There is no single standard for how to communicate this kind of uncertainty, and different outlets are making different choices about how much to emphasize the foreshock possibility. Inside the scientific community, the discussion is more technical. Seismologists are watching the aftershock sequence hour by hour. They're asking whether migration is becoming visible. They're asking whether the decay curve is starting to look more normal or continuing to look unusual. They are asking whether GPS stations are showing any anomalous deformation. Every incoming data point is being integrated into the ongoing assessment. The trouble with the 48-hour threshold is that it could pass without incident, and we would still not be safe. A foreshock sequence does not have to produce the main shock within 2 days. It could produce it in a week, a month, even longer. The 2011 pattern had a 51-hour gap, but that does not mean all foreshock sequences follow that timing. Some large earthquakes have been preceded by foreshock activity weeks in advance. And the trouble with the 48-hour threshold is also that it creates a psychological expectation. If the window passes without a larger event, people will relax. They will assume the threat has passed. They will return to normal routines. But if the system is still in an elevated state of activity, if the slip deficit remains large, if the stress transfer from today's event has loaded adjacent segments, the threat may not pass with the window. It may just become less acute, lingering in the background as a quiet probability for weeks or months to come. So we are entering a period of heightened attention, but also a period where the attention will at some point begin to fade. That is human nature. We cannot sustain high alert indefinitely, and the question of whether the fading attention is matched by a genuinely reduced threat is one that, again, only time will answer. The clock exists, but we don't know when it started. Part 18. What scientists are watching now. Let me walk you through what is actually being monitored right now in real time by the institutions responsible for assessing the situation. This is the infrastructure of modern earthquake monitoring, and understanding it will help you understand what counts as a signal and what counts as noise. GPS deformation monitoring is first on the list. Across Japan, hundreds of GPS stations are streaming data continuously, updating their positions to millimeter precision several times per second. Scientists are watching these stations for any anomalous motion, sudden jumps that would indicate fault slip, slow, gradual drifts that would indicate slow slip events, patterns of motion that would suggest the crust is deforming in ways inconsistent with normal post-earthquake relaxation. Seafloor pressure sensors are second. Japan has invested heavily in seafloor observation networks over the past 15 years, partly in response to the 2011 disaster. These networks include pressure sensors that can detect vertical seafloor displacement in real time. Pressure changes are converted into estimates of seafloor motion, which are used to track tsunami generation and to monitor for slow deformation of the fault interface itself. Hypocenter migration tracking is third. Every aftershock has a location, and as more aftershocks accumulate, scientists can plot their locations over time. They are looking for trends. Are the hypocenters drifting in a specific direction? Are they clustering at a boundary between a ruptured segment and a still locked segment? Are new earthquakes occurring in areas that were previously quiet? Aftershock decay patterns are fourth. Scientists are fitting the aftershock sequence to standard decay models like Mori's law to see how well it matches expected behavior. Deviations from the expected decay can indicate that the system is not behaving like a typical post-earthquake sequence. Accelerated activity, prolonged high rates, clustering at specific times or locations, all of these are tracked. Moment tensor analysis is fifth. For every earthquake of sufficient size, scientists compute the moment tensor, which describes the mechanism of the rupture. The moment tensor tells you the fault orientation, the direction of slip, the seismic moment released. From the moment tensor, you can derive estimates of the rupture area, the average slip, and the stress drop. These parameters are the inputs to the stress transfer calculations that are being performed tonight. Ocean tide gauges and buoys are sixth. Tsunami monitoring is continuous. Every tide gauge along the Japanese coast and every offshore buoy in the Pacific is reporting water levels in real time. The data is used both to track current tsunami activity and to calibrate models for future events. If any additional tsunami waves are generated by aftershocks or by related events, they will be detected and warned against almost immediately. Satellite-based geodetic monitoring is seventh. Synthetic aperture radar satellites can image the Earth's surface with extraordinary precision, and comparisons of before and after images can reveal ground deformation at centimetre scales over broad areas. These satellite observations will take days to weeks to produce, but when they do, They provide a nearly complete picture of how the crust moved during the rupture. Putting all of this together, scientists are asking two kinds of questions. What would indicate escalation, and what would indicate stabilization? Escalation signals would include continued high rates of aftershocks beyond the expected decay, clear migration of hypercenters toward a specific direction, GPS detection of slow-slip events or anomalous deformation, new earthquakes outside the immediate aftershock zone that could indicate stress transfer, and any changes in seafloor pressure that could indicate ongoing fault motion. Stabilization signals would include a decay curve that starts to match expected Amori behavior, hypocenters clustering without clear migration, GPS stations settling into post-earthquake relaxation patterns without anomalous motion, aftershocks confined to the immediate rupture zone without spreading, and tsunami monitoring showing no new generation. Right now, the signals are mixed. Some aspects of the sequence look concerning. Some aspects look normal. The picture is not yet clear enough to lean decisively in either direction, and that is the state of scientific knowledge tonight. Every hour that passes adds more data. Every aftershock, every GPS update, every seafloor pressure reading contributes to the ongoing assessment. Over the next several days, the picture will sharpen. We will know, with more confidence, which direction the system is heading. But tonight, as I speak these words, the story is still being written, in real time, by the rocks beneath the Pacific, by the instruments we have deployed to listen to them, and by the scientists who are trying to translate what they hear. The story is still being written. Part 19, The Three Possible Futures. Let me lay out, as clearly as I can, the three possible futures that we are looking at tonight. I am going to describe each one, give you a sense of how likely it is, and explain what its implications would be. The first possible future is that today's earthquake was an isolated main shock. This is, by base rate probability, the most likely outcome. Most magnitude 7+ earthquakes historically are not foreshocks. They are the main event, followed by a declining sequence of aftershocks, and the system returns to its long-term average behavior over the following weeks and months. If this is what happens, we will see the aftershock sequence settle into a standard decay pattern. The unusual early activity will prove to be statistical variance, not signal. GPS stations will show normal post-earthquake relaxation. The Japan Trench will, in a few weeks, be quieter than it is tonight, though not as quiet as it was before. Life along the Sanriku coast will return to its normal rhythms. Tsunami warnings will lift fully, trains will resume, the news cycle will move on. The probability of this scenario is high, maybe in the range of 70 to 85%, though the exact number depends on how you weight the various unusual features of tonight's sequence. If you weight them heavily, the probability of isolated main shock goes down. If you consider them statistical noise, it goes up. Different seismologists would give different numbers, and there is no single correct answer. The second possible future is that today's earthquake was a foreshock to a larger rupture. This is the scenario that is keeping every seismologist in Japan awake tonight. In this case, within hours, days, or weeks, the Japan Trench will produce a second, larger earthquake, possibly in the range of magnitude 8+, possibly in the worst case, approaching magnitude 9. If this is what happens, today's event will be retrospectively classified as a foreshock. The aftershock sequence we are now watching will be understood, in hindsight, as the precursor clustering that preceded the main rupture. Scientists will study this sequence for decades, trying to extract the signals that, in real time, were ambiguous. The probability of this scenario is low in absolute terms, but not negligible. Estimates would vary, but it could be in the range of 2 to 10%, again depending on how you weight the various features of tonight's sequence. That is not a high probability, but it is not zero, and it is high enough that it justifies the elevated alert posture that Japan is maintaining tonight. The third possible future is what I will call the multi-event stress cycle. In this scenario, today's earthquake is neither an isolated main shock nor a foreshock to an immediately larger event, but rather one event in a sequence of major earthquakes that will play out over months or years as the fault system redistributes stress after the 2011 rupture. If this is what happens, we might see the December 2025 event and today's event as two steps in a sequence, with additional major earthquakes to follow at irregular intervals over the coming years. Each one will release some stress, transfer some stress, and contribute to the ongoing readjustment of the fault system. None of them necessarily will be a single catastrophic main shock, but the cumulative effect will be an elevated period of activity compared to the long-term average. The probability of this scenario is moderate and harder to estimate. It is also, in some ways, the least observable in the short term because a stress cycle playing out over years does not announce itself in the first few days. We would only know we were in such a cycle by watching it unfold over time. All three of these scenarios are consistent with what we currently know. None of them can be ruled out based on tonight's data alone. The answer will emerge, scenario by scenario, as time passes. I want to emphasize something here. The fact that the most likely scenario is also the most reassuring one, the isolated main shock, is worth keeping in mind. The odds favour the outcome where tonight turns out to be the whole story. That is genuinely the base rate, and I do not want to overclaim a foreshock scenario when it is not the most probable outcome. But I also do not want to underclaim. The elevated probability of the less reassuring scenarios, even if they remain minority probabilities, is real, and it is what justifies the alertness, the monitoring, the continued evacuation zones, and the scientific vigilance that is happening tonight. All three futures are still on the table. We do not know which one we are in, and the waiting, which is the only option available to us, is the heart of what makes tonight so distinctive. Part 20. The Unresolved Ending. Let me bring us back now to where we started, to 4:52 in the afternoon on April 20th, 2026, when the seafloor off the coast of Miyako slipped and everything that has happened since began. A magnitude 7.4 to 7.5 earthquake, same fault system as 2011, same subduction interface, shallow depth, tsunami generating potential, tsunami warning issued within minutes for Iwate, Miyagi and Aomori. Coastal evacuations carried out with the kind of muscle memory that only comes from a country that has been here before and refuses to be caught off guard again. Nuclear inspections, including Fukushima Daiichi, a name that still carries weight in any sentence it appears in. No abnormalities detected. The immediate damage, manageable. And then the questions began. The epicenter, offset north of the 2011 rupture, in a slip deficit zone that has been flagged by hazard models for years as underloaded and unreleased. A region where, according to the geodetic data, the Pacific plate has been pushing and the rocks have been holding, year after year, decade after decade, storing strain like a compressed spring that has not yet snapped. The magnitude close to that of the 2011 foreshock. Close enough to catch the attention of every seismologist who has studied that sequence in detail. The aftershock sequence, not decaying the way aftershock sequences are supposed to decay. Multiple magnitude 5+ events within hours. More than a dozen magnitude 4.5+ events inside a single 7-hour window. A shallow magnitude 5.6 at roughly 2.2 kilometers below the seafloor, on what may be a splay fault structure, the kind of geometry that turns modest earthquakes into disproportionate tsunamis. Early signs, ambiguous but real, that something about this sequence is not fitting the normal pattern. The historical echo, impossible to ignore. 51 hours in March of 2011, between a magnitude 7.3 that nobody recognised as a foreshock and a magnitude 9.1 that destroyed northeastern Japan. A pattern that, only in hindsight, became clear. A window during which the signals were there in the data, but not translated into warning. A window during which people along the Sanriku coast went about their days, picked their children up from school, walked home from work, poured tea, sat down to dinner, and had no idea that the ground beneath them was already counting down. Tonight, we are possibly in a similar window. We cannot be sure. The scientific community cannot be sure. The Japanese government cannot be sure. The nuclear inspectors cannot be sure. The coastal residents who are still, as I speak, sheltering in designated evacuation areas cannot be sure. Nobody, anywhere in the world tonight has the ability to look at this situation and say with confidence whether tonight was the whole story or the opening scene of something else. What we have, instead, is a carefully calibrated response to uncertainty. Japan has spent the 15 years since 2011 building systems, protocols and institutional memory designed precisely for this moment. The aggressive tsunami warnings, issued within minutes and maintained for hours after the first small waves arrived, the automatic nuclear inspections, conducted whether or not anyone in the control room actually expected to find damage. The 7-day elevated advisory, the continuous monitoring of the aftershock sequence, the public messaging that leans cautious because cautious is what survives. All of it is the legacy of what was lost last time. All of it is a refusal to be caught unprepared again. And that refusal is, in some ways, the most important legacy of 2011. Not the seawalls, though the seawalls matter. Not the improved evacuation systems, though those matter too. But the cultural knowledge that a modest-seeming earthquake in this fault system can, in rare cases, be the prologue to something much worse. That knowledge is present in every decision being made tonight. It is the reason a 40-centimetre first wave did not reassure anyone on the Sanriku coast. It is the reason nuclear inspections happen automatically, without waiting for someone to call for them. It is the reason the tone of official statements is cautious rather than dismissive, even when the visible damage is limited and the initial tsunami was small. Japan is a country that learned, in the most brutal way possible, that the first signal is not always the full story. And tonight, that lesson is doing exactly what it was intended to do. But even with all of that knowledge, with all of that preparation, with all of that institutional memory, we still cannot answer the central question. We still do not know whether tonight is the end or the beginning. We still cannot read, with certainty, what the rocks beneath the Pacific are going to do next, because knowing that a pattern once existed is not the same as knowing whether the pattern is repeating. History can inform us. It cannot decide for us. And the decision, tonight, rests with a fault system that does not answer to our deadlines or our emotional needs. The aftershocks continue. As I speak these words, new events are being logged by seismic stations across Japan and around the world. Stations in Tōhoku, stations in Tokyo, stations on remote Pacific islands, stations in the continental United States, in Europe, in Antarctica, all picking up the faint seismic tremors from the ongoing sequence. Each one is a fragment of information. Each one is a data point in an unfolding story. And somewhere in the pattern of those aftershocks, in their timing, their depths, their magnitudes, their migration through space, if we could read it clearly, is the answer to tonight's question. But we cannot read it clearly. Not yet. Possibly not in time. The tools we have to interpret the data are powerful, but they are not oracles. They can tell us what has happened. They can tell us with some confidence what is happening right now. They cannot tell us with certainty what is going to happen next. And the gap between what we can measure and what we can predict is the gap we are standing inside tonight. So we do what humans have always done when they face uncertainty they cannot resolve. We prepare for multiple outcomes. We maintain vigilance. We share what we know and admit what we do not. We ask the question out loud, knowing that the asking itself is part of the answer, and we wait, not passively, not resigned. But with our hands on the monitors, our eyes on the data, our ears tuned to every creak of the earth beneath us. The waiting is the hardest part. The waiting is the story. The waiting is what distinguishes tonight from a routine post-earthquake recovery. Because tonight, we are not just processing what has happened. We are holding space for what might still happen. We are sitting with a possibility that, 15 years ago, none of us had time to sit with before it arrived. In 2011, there was no waiting. There was just the event itself and then the aftermath. Tonight, there is a pause, a window, a space inside which we are fully aware of what might be coming, even as we remain unable to stop it. That space did not exist last time. It exists now. And how we use it, how we think inside it, how we act from within it, is a test that neither science nor society has really ever faced at this scale. And that, in its strange and difficult way, is a kind of progress. Not the progress of being able to predict earthquakes, which we still cannot. Not the progress of being able to prevent disasters, which we still cannot. But the progress of being aware, in real time, of what might be happening. The progress of knowing what we do not know. The progress of having the language to say, out loud to each other, that tonight might be a foreshock, even if only time will tell whether we were right to say so. 15 years ago, this conversation would not have been possible. The vocabulary was not there. The data was not there. The monitoring networks were not there. Tonight, every one of those pieces is in place, and the conversation is happening in real time, in labs and newsrooms and living rooms around the world. In 2011, the warning came first, and nobody knew what it was. Tonight, we know exactly what it might be. We know the fault system. We know the history. We know the signals that have been observed in the aftershock data. We know the hazard models that flagged this region. We know the 51-hour gap that defines the 2011 precedent. We know the geometry, the mechanism, the depth distribution, the concept of slip deficit, the concept of stress transfer, the concept of splay faults and how they amplify tsunamis. We know everything that 15 years ago we did not know how to see. And that may be the most unsettling part, because knowing does not mean controlling. Knowing does not mean preventing. Knowing only means that if something larger is coming, we will have watched it coming. We will have recognized what was happening. We will have had the language to describe it. We will have written the papers and updated the models and briefed the press, but we will not have been able to stop it. The rocks do not read our papers. The fault does not subscribe to our journals. The Pacific Plate does not pause to consider our hazard advisories before it slips. The Japan Trench does not care what we know. It does not care about our monitoring networks, our hazard models, our institutional memory, our evacuation protocols, our scientific conferences, our YouTube videos, or our best calibrated uncertainty estimates. It will do what it is going to do, according to the stress state of the rocks, according to the physics of fault systems, according to the timescales of tectonic motion that dwarf every human life and every human civilization. The plates have been moving for hundreds of millions of years. They were moving long before anyone thought to measure them. They will be moving long after the last seismograph has gone silent. All we can do is watch and prepare and hope that tonight is the whole story, even as we prepare for the possibility that it is not. And keep asking, even as the hours pass and the aftershock sequence continues, the question that is the real story of this night. Was this the main event, or was it the warning? The answer is out there. It is already decided, already encoded in the current state of the subduction interface beneath the Pacific. Somewhere in the arrangement of the rocks, in the pattern of the locked patches and the slipping patches, in the silent crawl of slow slip events and the accumulated strain of 15 years of quiet, the answer has already been written. We just cannot read it yet. And when we finally can, it will be because either the main shock has arrived and clarified everything in retrospect, or because enough time has passed without one that we can, with some confidence, say that tonight was the whole story. Until then, we sit with the uncertainty. We sit with the question. We sit with the knowledge that the same fault system that 15 years ago produced the worst disaster in modern Japanese history has, tonight, done something that at least rhymes with the opening move of that disaster. Not the same verse, not the same notes, but the same key, the same time signature. Close enough to notice, close enough to care. The story is not finished. The aftershocks are still happening. The monitoring continues. The scientists are still watching. The GPS stations are still streaming. The seafloor pressure sensors are still reporting. The tide gauges along the Sanriku coast are still measuring every centimetre of water that moves against the harbour walls, and we, the rest of us, are watching with them. From whatever distance, in whatever time zone, through whatever screen, from Tokyo, from Los Angeles, from London, from Nairobi, from every corner of a planet that tonight is briefly united by a single, unresolved question. We are all tonight in some way, part of the audience for a story whose ending we do not yet know. A story whose ending will, one way or another, reveal itself in the coming hours or days or weeks, or if we are lucky, never at all, because nothing larger ever comes, and tonight fades, as most nights do, into the long record of almost. In the meantime, we keep our eyes open, we keep our minds clear, we keep our questions honest, and we respect the machinery that runs beneath us, the machinery that has shaped every coastline, built every mountain, and written every chapter of the geological history of this planet, a machinery that does not know we exist and does not need to, and would continue running whether or not any of us were here to watch. The machinery is running tonight, and the question it is asking, the question we are all asking with it, is one that we will not be able to answer until it decides to answer for us. Stay safe out there. Stay informed. Keep watching the sky. And now, tonight, keep an ear to the ground. Because in 2011 the warning came first, and nobody knew what it was. Tonight we know exactly what it might be, and that may be the most unsettling part of all.